Afreximbank TV.
Fantastic, Chido, Special Envoy of the African Union for Youth. So it's fantastic to have you here on Afreximbank TV. So I think one of the themes of this event is Global Africa. And ultimately, if anyone's going to create a global Africa, is the youth of today. To some extent, our predecessors have let us down in terms of globalizing our continent. So what's the role of youth, and how do you see the youth helping globalize the continent?
Thank you very much, Omar, for having me, first of all. And just to speak about how I see the young people getting involved in this, I think it's very important that first and foremost, our policies should include young people. When we talk about the continent in Africa, even in the Caribbean, for instance, over 60% of the population are young people, but you find that a majority of people that you find in the rooms are the 40%. So why is it that in most platforms the majority are not there? It means we need to be more intentional, just like what Afreximbank is doing, for instance. And as much as we might not have the majority of 40%, but we do have representation of young people and a day that's dedicated for young people, to speak in terms of how we bridge the generations. So I think it starts off with our policies. It starts with the private sector, the public sector. How do we create these avenues for more young people to be at the decision-making table? This also helps with sustainability, because 10 to 20 years down the line, the young people we have today are the ones that are going to be in the leadership positions. But not only that, we also need to capacitate them and empower them, because if they're not trained for the Africa that we want and for global Africa, then even when they come to the table, they don't know how to contribute. And it's something that we've been trying, especially in my role as the Special Envoy on Youth to the African Union chairperson, where we've trying to create opportunities and access for young people. For the first time at the African Union Heads of State Summit, which happened in February, I had a delegation of 35 young people that joined me even in the closed sessions with the head of states, and they're actually putting together a research policy paper, something we worked on in partnership with Afreximbank as well. We have the UN General Assembly, for instance, coming up in September. Again, at the UN General Assembly, for the first time ever, we have the Summit of the Future. Now, the Summit of the Future already is talking about what's going to replace the SDG goals that are almost coming to an end 6 years from now. And intentionally, as well as an office, we've created what we call the Panel of the Future for Africa. We will also be participating at the Summit of the Future and also making contributions to the discussions in relation to Africa's position. Because again, 10 years down the line, these are the leaders that we're going to have today, but also for tomorrow.
So often when we talk about the youth, we blame the older generations for not having the youth at the table. But what about the youth themselves? I mean, do you see them engaged enough in politics, in decision making, in business? Are they as engaged as they should be, or have you got a message for them as well?
Honestly, I believe that as young people, we can still do more. We also need to be intentional, do the relevant research that's needed in terms of getting into the rooms. I've noticed, for instance, when I got into my role, I embarked on a listening tour. This listening tour was across Africa, but also in the diaspora, because I really wanted to understand what the young people's perspectives about Agenda 2063, about the African Union, and how they can contribute. But a number of people were actually not aware. But then I also, was encouraging young people to say, actually, also go and do your research. Most of this information you can find online, on the internet, but then also not forgetting the marginalized communities. It's so easy to say, find the information on the internet, but we still have challenges in terms of how we bridge the digital divide. Again, another initiative, we're actually working with Afreximbank in my office to look at how we bridge the digital divide for young people across Africa. On the other end, I believe it's a balance, and as much as young people need to come to the table themselves, we need to, motivate and make sure that they go for the opportunities, but the policymakers also need to make it conducive. We need to find out what are the reasons we have young people not in political positions and not in parliament. Could it be that they're discouraged from what they see? I've seen, for instance, this year being like a very big election year that we have in Africa. I just came 2 weeks ago from South Africa as one of the election observers. Another initiative we have as the African Union to ensure that by the end of the year we're 45% of young people as part of the electoral processes across Africa. But having said that, a number of feedback that I receive from young people, for instance, is to say they cannot afford the fees to run the office. They're afraid of their lives because of conflict that they've seen within their countries, democracy and human rights. So it's a balance, really. Young people can come to the table, and they should be intentional about coming to the table, but are we making sure that the table is actually prepared for them.
Okay, and in terms of elections and politics, as you said, I mean, ignore the youth at your peril. And I think if we've seen some protest votes to some extent in Senegal and South Africa, it is because the youth is actually articulating its message and saying we want change, we want things done differently.
Yeah.
So politicians need to listen to the youth because actually they've got the power of the ballot, and the power of the ballot is getting stronger. But I want to talk about banking in general ultimately, and capital. Without capital you can't do much. So do you feel that the financial services industry as a whole is paying attention to the youth and is trying to create new instruments to be able to support youth initiatives, entrepreneurs, etc., or where would you like to see more work to be done?
Okay, so it's quite interesting because I was a banker myself before, getting into this political position at the African Union. I worked 7 years in the banking sector at Standard Chartered Bank, and again, interesting enough, I was in the risk department. And one thing we found is that in terms of providing that relevant support and financing and funding for young people is usually very difficult because of the risk that comes with it. So I believe within the financial sector, there's more that can be done in terms of how we mitigate that risk. Can we make sure there's a balance if there are opportunities for young people to be provided with credit, for instance, or to be provided with capital for their businesses? But do we also have a mentorship initiatives to make sure that when they receive that funding, in as much as they might be at a high risk, but at the same time, we get to mitigate that risk by providing them with additional support. Having said that, there are a number of initiatives that I've seen ongoing, even with Afreximbank, a number of initiatives supporting young creatives, grants that are available for young people. We've seen, for instance, even with other banks, for instance, Afro Development Bank, where they have this new initiatives where they're creating banks across Africa for young people that are going to be led by young people, that are going to be run by young people, and that are also going to have better interest rates for young people. When you talk about trade, for instance, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Just this year at the AU Heads of State Summit, there was a decision for a protocol for women and youth. So in as much as there's trade going on from country to country, we've also negotiated for a protocol. This is under the Secretary General for the AFCFTA, Wamkele Mene, but I've also had an opportunity to be part of that team and part of the consultations in terms of coming up with that protocol for lower tariffs for women and youth when they trade across the continent, and making sure the opportunities for financing for them as well, and the payment systems too.
Fantastic. And the last question relating back to Global Africa and the Afreximbank and the theme of this event. So ultimately, would you say that today's youth, obviously through better connectivity, has got that mindset of the world belongs to us as opposed to being in a region or a country? Would you say that it's a reality within the youth that there are no borders and you can interact, trade, invest, move around the world a lot more easily than you could 50 years ago?
Well, honestly speaking, I mean, the zeal is there for young people to do that, but it doesn't mean that it's been made easy for us, especially for those that are affected the conflict. As we all know what's been happening, including in Sudan. I'll give a specific example. I have an initiative that I run in my office, which is a youth reference committee that has 45 members from across Africa, which is like a think tank, and they also get to engage with their counterparts and their peers in Europe. And through that, they've also had to contribute. They've also, been contributing in policy, in foreign policy, where, just recently, last month, with the German government, they contributed to the Africa policy for Germany, for instance. And last year, we went to Austria to have an engagement and a dialogue with the National Youth Council in Austria. But having said that, it was so difficult to get all of them there. Not everyone got a visa. Those that were coming from Sudan could not get a visa because of the conflict happening in their country. They're deemed a high risk to even be able to travel in Europe, to even be able to travel across Africa. So this really affects young people the most, in terms of issues to do with conflict, in not just globally, but also within our continent. Young people are the victims. Young people as well then are affected the most in terms of migration. Young people are the ones that are used in terms of the weapons of war, and are the ones that are actually going, within the streets and fighting amongst one another, whilst the leaders will be sitting in their hotel rooms and giving their instructions. So we need to do more, really, for young people in this regard. It's not so easy, but you also see the resilience of young people. I see the resilience of my peers wherever I go, when I embark on the listening tour, when I've gone to marginalized communities. One thing I can tell you and I can assure you is young people are resilient. Even for me, it's not easy being a woman, being young, and having to sit in such a position in the cabinet of the chairperson. You constantly have to be fighting for young people, but also making sure that the voices are heard within that table. And as much as there is that support that comes from our African member states, the support that comes from the cabinet of the chairperson and the chairperson who appointed me himself, but then you still constantly have to make sure that the voice is raised for young people that are affected by conflict.
And at the decision-making table, is it tougher being a young person or being a woman?
Both.
Thank you very much for your time, Excellency.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
Enjoyed this.